Hey guys, it's John and Shannon from That DIY Couple. Ellie was born during a very unique time in the world, and when she was born, we had a decision to make about whether we wanted to send her to daycare, which was kind of our default choice, whether or not we wanted to have an au pair, which Shannon is actually an expert in due to her mom, and she'll get into that, or whether we wanted to have a nanny, which is maybe the most expensive option, but one that we hadn't really considered seriously before the global pandemic. So our choices were between a nanny, which is somebody who is just a normal employee that you pay and watches your child, usually lives in the US already. An au pair, who's someone here on a special program, a special visa through all sorts of coordinated actions that's here to care for your child. Or a daycare, which is where you send your child to somebody else's home or facility.
Our baseline assumption was that we were going to send Ellie to daycare after my maternity leave. We price shopped, and we were thinking mostly in terms of dollars and cents, because when you have only one child, daycare in our area is cheaper than employing someone full-time to work in your home.
And that's sort of the default option, because a lot of our friends that have had kids recently have done that option, mostly because it's the most cost-effective option. It's way cheaper.
I started reading a lot about attachment theory and attachment parenting. And attachment theory in parenting basically holds that you have this key period in a child's life between ages 0 and 3, that's thought, where the child starts to develop a type of attachment, either secure or insecure, to a primary caregiver. And so it's thought that it's really important to be extremely responsive to an infant child's needs in order for that person to feel psychologically at peace and to be able to feel safe in the world and develop healthy romantic relationships later in life. And we all come into this world feeling terrified and alone and needing warmth and love and care and someone to be very responsive to our needs. As I got pregnant and I was reading about this, I started reflecting a lot on my own childhood and some of the anxieties and insecurities that I experienced as an adult. And I realized that I am a very insecurely attached child. It became really important to me that I not repeat that mistake with Ellie. I didn't have the option or inclination to stay home from work after having Ellie. And so I knew that after the 4.5 months that I generously get from my company for maternity leave, that Ellie was going to be cared for by someone else. And it became really important to me to find a special person to take care of Ellie and someone who I trusted, respond to her with love and tenderness and kindness every time that she cried.
And I think the second aspect to what Shannon just described is that when we were making this decision about daycare versus in-home care, the virus in 2020 was really raging out of control in our area. So we were also just scared from a practical sense about sending our young baby to a place where we weren't sure who else was there, weren't really sure what exact protocols and safety the people that were there were taking. We didn't know how things would evolve over time, and obviously, unfortunately, they haven't evolved super positively. The biggest two things that factored away for daycare for us were A, as Shannon described, this idea of attachment parenting that we very much subscribe to, and B, concern about just her getting sick and infected and possibly infecting us and other people just by being at daycare in this very unique time of human existence. Once we eliminated daycare and we determined that we could afford other options besides daycare, which as Shannon said is a huge privilege, the decision for us was between a nanny or an au pair.
An au pair is usually a 18 to 27-year-old, typically female, who comes from all over the world to live in the United States and take care of kids with a family and what's called a host family for 1 year, sometimes 2. It's typically cheaper than having a nanny.
Something that's really important to know about an au pair is that they live with you. So you need to provide them housing, usually in your own house. Mm-hmm. So that's a big expense too, because if you don't have space for them or room for them or whatever else, you need to make accommodations to facilitate that. You have to incorporate that into your total costs. I think that au pairs are also limited in the amount of hours they can work. I believe there's also an educational requirement where they have to go to school. There are a couple of issues that kind of wrap around the total cost, and the actual having of an au pair that are different than you might expect from like a nanny. An au pair changes every year or every 2 years. And so with the attachment parenting idea, as Shannon mentioned before, the concept is that the child forms a very secure attachment with one adult or maybe a few adults in those first 3 years of life. And with an au pair, just by the nature of the program, optimistically you might get the same au pair who's going to be there for 2 years, but at some point there's going to be turnover between who the primary caregiver is during the day for your child. Right. And that, from an attachment parenting perspective for us, was really bad. And Shannon's experience with au pairs was that, which is she would form a bond sometimes with au pairs, sometimes not with au pairs, and then even if she'd formed a bond with the au pair, they would leave and then a new one would come.
When you're like 5 and you sort of fall in love with a caregiver who's like your everything for a period of time, it's actually really traumatic to have that person leave totally without explanation, and then to have the same experience again the next year and the next year and the next year. It's like just when you're starting to trust, just when you're trying to get to know them, to have them yanked away is like pretty traumatic for a kid. We decided that for our family, what we wanted was someone who we could have a long-term relationship with, someone who could become like a family member to us and who our kids could have memories of, and who would be a stable, wonderful, loving, consistent presence in their life.
One of the biggest pros of having a nanny is you can have a nanny for many years of the child's life, and they can know the child as the child matures and grows up and gets older. Another big, huge advantage of having a nanny is that you can pick a nanny who has the personality and the responsibility and also the childcare experience that you might prefer. So in our case, we have a nanny who has raised her own 3 children to adulthood, prior to working for us. We know that she drives a car. In fact, she actually lived with us for a full year before she started working with us as a nanny. We have 2 extra bedrooms, both of which we had rented out kind of before the pandemic times. And one of the people that we rented to was the woman who is now our nanny. We really loved her. We got to know her because we lived with her. And a huge benefit for us was that she spoke Spanish natively. And both Shannon and I speak Spanish. But we thought it'd be amazing for Ellie to learn Spanish essentially as a native language from a very young age. And so our nanny, and we asked our nanny to do this, speaks to Ellie only in Spanish. And I think that's an amazing benefit that she'll have growing up.
When she first watched our dogs, when we came back from vacation, they were waiting outside her room. They preferred her to us. And I heard her, I woke up late and was going into work late one morning, and I heard her in the hallway. I don't think she realized I was still home, speaking to them in Spanish, saying, "Good morning, my little prince. How are you?" And she was so loving and so kind that at that moment I turned to John, and I was pregnant with Ellie, and I said, "Do you think that if we asked her, Adriana would quit her job at the bank and be our nanny?" And he said, "It doesn't hurt to ask." And so we actually poached her from like her job doing something totally different as a bank, but we just knew she didn't have like childcare paid experience, but she had 3 children and she loved them very much. And we saw that she had a loving and caring relationship with them as adults. And it just felt like God, honestly. She said the same thing to me, that when she said a prayer the night before she saw my Craigslist ad, where she said, "God, please give me something with nice people in my budget that I can afford." And we had just put the same day the ad out at a very low price to attract a lot of people. And so for me, it felt like it was meant to be. But the takeaway for you is to just trust your gut and what's right for your family.
So just to be clear, the cons of having a nanny as opposed to everything else that we were talking about is a nanny is way more expensive. We pay Adriana something like $40,000 a year. And Adriana works every day from 8 until 6, Monday through Friday. And we also pay for a portion of her health insurance, which was a deal that we made with her when we hired her. She's a full-time employee of ours, which means that we have to pay payroll taxes. And in our case, we actually give her housing as well because she lives here. It's not a requirement. Many people have nannies where they live somewhere else and just work at their home during the day. But that's the way that we wanted to structure it. And we had this extra room that we weren't using. So, the total all-in cost for the nanny for us is definitely significant. But for all the reasons that Shannon said, and I think the biggest one being attachment parenting, the idea that Ellie can and has formed a strong attachment and bond with her, and that we trust her so much and really love her, really tipped the scales for us. And as Shannon said, we're in a financial position where we're able to do that. So I'd love to hear if you guys have any thoughts about nannies versus au pairs versus daycare. I know many of our viewers are parents. So if you guys made this decision about your children, please let us know. But in the meantime,
do well and always make things better.
Oh.